So thank you, Gareth, for inviting me today, and what an amazing event that this is going to be. And I'm really delighted to be here with a number of hats on. I'm from Sheffield. I've lived most of my entire adult life in Sheffield. And I was even more delighted to be asked to be one of the directors of the university's new Institute for Sustainable Food, because sustainable food for everybody, there's really been a passion for not just my career, but for my life personally as well. And I've had some amazing opportunities to help shape the food system globally, and to think about the kind of things that we need to do to make food sustainable and available and affordable for all. I was incredibly privileged back in 2015 to be invited to speak at the United Nations Climate Summit in Paris, COP21, to talk about the role of food in the climate system and how achieving sustainable food is one of the big wins that will get us towards emissions reductions that will allow us to stay within global boundaries. So I went to Paris and I spoke at length about the perilous state of our agricultural soils, because ultimately pretty much everything that we eat is derived from soil. And I think an amazing quote from a farming group in America that really resonated with me was that we owe our entire existence on this planet to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. So I spoke about the soil, and spoke about the soil as an invaluable and non-renewable resource that was capable of helping us mitigate climate change, but also was central to being able to feed our growing population. And this went down quite well with most people, but it did get me my first bit of social media trolling, where I was trolled by Breitbart News and a range of other right-wing press from America, who described me as a peddler of university disaster pornography. I'm not quite sure how one peddles disaster pornography, but if it upsets Breitbart, I'm all for it. But for me, Paris was much more of a learning opportunity. It was a real meeting of minds of people from different backgrounds, different disciplines, to share what we all knew about climate change and work out how we might fix it. One of the things that I find frustrating about these kind of meetings is that we talk about the problem, but where are the solutions? And solutions is what myself and my colleagues at the Institute for Sustainable Food are all about. Now, I think it's pretty obvious to all of us that the food, or the environment that we draw our food from, is being squeezed from all directions, from nutrient limitation in our soils and the need for extensive use of chemical fertilizers in industrial agriculture, the amount of energy that agriculture consumes an enormous quantity of the global energy budget. And just making nitrogen fertilizer alone, from work we've done at the Institute, we've been able to reveal the phenomenal waste of energy that comes from inappropriate use of fertilizers. We have drought and the changing in our seasons that we really now are seeing bite hard as an impact of global change, and impacting the people that have the least resources to deal with it. And finally, from my perspective, the soil. Now, I'm a soil microbiologist. I've spent my career trying to eavesdrop on the conversations that microbes have between one another and plants in the soil, and to work out how we could use those microbes to make food more sustainable. So it maybe doesn't come as a surprise that soil was my real interest here. So what I'm going to do very quickly is take you on a whistle-stop tour from London to Paris, from Sheffield to Paris, we've already done. We're now going to fly over to Oman in the most sustainable way possible, of course, to Jordan, and then we're going to come back to the UK, and we're going to embed some learning about how we might change our food systems for the better, to make them more sustainable and more equitable. So coming back from Paris, this kind of squeezed agricultural landscape picture is one that that really started to crystallize in my mind. And I wondered, well, what technologies are out there that are deployable and reasonable now that we could possibly bring together to solve this problem? And this was really an idea championed by my very close friend and collaborator, Professor Tony Wright, who is the director of the Grantham Centre for Sustainable Futures at the University of Sheffield. So we worked together to try and reimagine how we could solve these problems and whether or not it was practical to deploy those solutions right now and across the globe. And it all really started probably 10 years ago or more, where we'd had a big project funded by the Engineering and Physics Research Council, the Sciences Research Council, which was all about thinking about how do you make a green roof that you could just slop on top of a building without having to mess around with infrastructure and that was within the limits of those buildings. And that was borne out by a series of planning requirements in Sheffield and other cities at the time. And we invented a technology that used polyurethane foam, so car seats, that was lightweight and could last essentially forever. And once that project had finished, you move on to other things. We hadn't had the chance to really do that much with it until we stumbled across these tubs full of our old mattress foam and planted green roof material that had been left in our outside our greenhouses at the university for years, about 4 or 5 years. No one touched them. And what shocked us was the ecosystem that had developed within this polyurethane foam that we created. So I think we thought we'd found an alternative for soil. And this is nothing new. Hydroponics has been going on since ancient times. But one of the biggest problems with it, and the reason that it isn't as sustainable as you might think, is because of the use of growing media that can take the base of organic materials as well as inorganic materials, but none of which are sustainable. So that's where we thought, right, we're going to square this circle. We're going to build synthetic soils made out of polyurethane foam that are infinitely recyclable, incredibly low impact on the planet, and very cheap to produce. And Dr. Harry Wright, who was then a PhD student with Tony and I, was able to work out exactly how to do that. And these plants are just literally growing in blocks of foam that Harry designed and produced. And this time-lapse video, I think, really shows you what's achievable from essentially a bit of old car mattress. So we found an alternative for soil. And the rest of the technologies are pretty much plug and play. We can become much more efficient at using nutrients, using things like hydroponics. We can develop and apply renewable energy technologies. And we can find a way to make it rain through desalination of seawater, so removing salt from seawater using solar energy. And if you put all of these technologies together, we realized you could build something that we dubbed the microcosm farm. But now came the job of convincing someone that this was possible, that we could build something like this to demonstrate how all these technologies working together could be very, very sustainable. We were lucky enough to be able to go back to the climate conference that was in Marrakesh a year after Paris, which was focused on solutions. My team and Tony's team met with colleagues from across the world, but we very quickly realized that a partnership was forming with a university in the Middle East, in Jordan. It was trying to develop these kind of sustainable food production technologies for a country that is highly reliant on food imports and whose food prices are incredibly volatile as a result of those food importation markets. So a couple of years after that train journey back from Paris and thinking about our microcosm farm, we built it. I say we built it. Jake Nichols, who led the project from Sheffield, and a team from Oman built the microcosm farm. And as you can see, it worked. all of these technologies together mean this facility essentially has a net zero footprint, or very close to net zero. And it uses very small amounts of non-renewable resources, and the kind of plasticware that it's based on will last for a long time. And at the same time as this was happening, Tony, who's in this picture, in this picture, had been spending a lot of time working in the refugee camps associated with the Syrian conflict in Jordan. And he found an old abandoned warehouse that was absolutely jam-packed full of mattresses. So I get the most excited text message I've ever got saying, can you turn these into allotments? So could we make green beds out of old beds? So I said, fetch me some back, which they did. And we spent a bit of time working out how to grow stuff in it. And we succeeded. We were able to produce really impressive crops of tomatoes and other crops that we were able to test and make sure were safe for consumption. And the reason we wanted to do that is because the Zachary refugee camp is one of the most barren places I've ever been. It's like the surface of the moon. And it really doesn't have the colour green. And mentally, the refugees were finding the absence of the colour green really hard, especially since they knew how to grow. But the Jordanian government didn't want this site to become permanent. So to make it non-permanent, they made it illegal for anyone to plant anything in the ground. So having sense checked that this would work, we were really fortunate to be able to work with a Syrian refugee himself who came to Sheffield, Dr. Moed al-Musulmani, who together with the Sheffield team was able to design a training program at the United Nations base camp at Zachary. And these are some pictures of some of our early examples. This is the greenhouse that they built. All of this is out of recycled material. There's nothing new bought here. Things that were found around the camp. And the project took off. We were very fortunate to get about over £200,000 now in crowdfunding to keep this project going. We've already trained over 1,000 refugees, and in the next 3 years, we will have trained 9,000 more. And that means 9,000 families have access to fresh fruit and vegetables that otherwise would be completely unattainable to them. But we learned a lot. We learned a hell of a lot from our experience in Oman and in Jordan. When we came back to Sheffield and working with a large group of stakeholders, it became obvious that actually some of the embedded learning for low-cost hydroponic systems to produce food cheaply that could act as a catalyst for training in the community was something that Sheffield could really benefit from. So through the council and Studio Polpo, we were availed of a site in Tinsley where we created Sheffield's first hydroponic, one of Sheffield's first commercial scale hydroponic gardens. So this is the old school at Tinsley. And the idea was to use very low cost technologies that were easy to put together, that meant any meanwhile space like this, and what I mean by meanwhile is that you can use it in the meanwhile while another purpose is found for it, would enable us to build a business model, which we are happily really working on now, that would allow us to produce food in the urban environment sustainably and cheaply. And the government has invested a significant amount of money in this now for Sheffield. So we'll be building a series of demonstrator sites across the city, including with Gareth at Regather, to test out and sense check some of this technology. I'm sorry that was a bit pixelated, but that gives you an idea of the scalable modular systems that Jacob and others were able to design and build. So what's the future of all this technology? Is it really capable of solving these huge global problems? And I really think it is. I have a bit of a problem with the idea that global problems need global solutions, and sure, some of them do. That's absolutely the case. But I think we really undervalue the importance of local innovation and local understanding of food systems associated with particular places. And we often turn our back on the innovation that's happening in those communities and consider it and see it as potentially just a small component of achieving a sustainable food future. And I fundamentally disagree with that. I think local innovation and expansion of local food production can be far more than life enriching. It can form a viable part of our response to the climate crisis by producing low carbon, sustainable and affordable food, and really embodying the values-based food system ideas that Regather and Sheffood have been helping to pioneer. And I'm not going to say much about this paper because I know Jill Edmondson will be talking later, but one of the things we've thought about is, if we took Sheffield as a case study, what technologies could we use in Sheffield in order to make it self-sustainable for the food that it produces? And do we have enough space? And Jill will talk to you about this later, I'm sure, but we do have enough space to produce as much food as we need if we're creative, and particularly if we take in technology. Now, this is a big technological diagram showing the linkages between the different parts in which parts of the city in which we could grow food. But I want to focus on here and come back to our idea of growing stuff on top of buildings. And these green roofs could be fundamentally different. With the technologies that we've developed in Sheffield, coupled to new technologies that are coming on market, and critically evaluated by really open and deep partnerships with organisations like Regather to help us sense check the validity of our approach, and also to act as delivery partners to help us solve the problems that will inevitably arise as we start to deploy this technology.